Welcome to our first vlog of 2025. I'm Chrissy Smales and I'm a professional support lawyer in the commercial real estate team here at Cripps. I'm very pleased to be able to welcome today Anna Favre, who is a partner in our residential estates team and also head of our London and urban estates sector team. Richard Blackman, who is a partner in our commercial real estate team and head of our development sector team, and also Vicky Murray, who is a partner in our commercial real estate team and also in our investor sector team. Now, this time last year, what with building safety, planning, leasehold and corporate reform all jostling for centre stage, it seemed that there was little that wasn't being reformed. We had several significant pieces of legislation in the pipeline and they were all in the process of enactment or implementation, and then we had the general election. Now, this had a significant impact on the direction of travel for property-related legislation and in turn, of course, on market forces in the industry. In terms of the legal landscape, we had some fairly large pieces of legislation, including the Building Safety Act and the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act, enacted, receiving royal assent in the last couple of years. The pattern that we've seen is these pieces of legislation are enacted, but then we rely on further secondary legislation, so secondary regulations, in order to bring into force pieces of those main acts. And that brings with it periods of uncertainty, and if there's one thing that the market doesn't like, it is uncertainty. So what happens next? What happens in 2025? Well, suffice to say, there's going to be no let-up this year. It's going to be another very busy year, and it will be interesting to see which items on the legislative agenda the government actually manages to kick into touch. Let's start perhaps with the slipperiest customer of them all, and that is leasehold reform.
Yes.
So we've got the triad of the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act 2023, that was enacted in October 2023. We've got the Leasehold and Freehold Reform Act of 2024, rushed through obviously in the wash-up before the election was called. And now we've got the Renters Reform Bill, known as the Renters' Rights Bill. And we spent a lot of time and energy talking about those pieces of legislation last year, and a lot of time talking about reform in the residential property market. Suffice to say, this is probably an area that would stand alone on its own vlog or even a series of vlogs. But for now, in terms of implementing change, the government have recognised, I think, that there's a need to balance speed with care and to ensure that the measures that are actually brought into force are to the lasting benefit of leaseholders and residential freeholders. Anna, perhaps you could give us an overview of the changes that you think will actually come into force this year.
Thanks, Chrissy. Well, you've probably seen at the end of this month, we're expecting the 2-year ownership rule to be abolished. That is one of the easiest procedural changes to implement and a bit of an easy win from the government's perspective. So that will do is sweep away the requirement to have owned the lease for a minimum period of 2 years before you can extend it. In terms of other changes brought in under LAFRA, it's a wait-and-see exercise. We are promised by the government that there will be changes in terms of right to manage. So, for example, changing the threshold from 25% to 50% for non-resi. Certain service charge changes are anticipated as well. And of course, as you all know, in dealing with educating us lawyers on a daily basis, there are myriad issues around the service charge regime, which really underscore the unfairness of it in many regards. I think the driving factor behind LAFRA and all the associated legislation is to shift the balance of power between landlord and tenant. So the legislation is very much designed to empower the tenant so that its armoury is much stronger in terms of any remedies. There is, without question, a need to get on with it. As you've already identified, where you have a market which is uncertain, where the status quo remains unclear, that can have a stultifying effect upon transactions, and it can really cause the industry to grind to a halt. Economically, we're facing some cyclical headwinds, as you know. I think the last thing that the leasehold sector in particular needs is more downward pressure in an already very stressed market. And the longer we delay bringing certain provisions into effect, the more difficult that will become. I also think in terms of consultations, you're probably aware that there will be certain consultations. Critically, in terms of the valuation methodology that has been revised under LAFRA for lease extensions and collective enfranchisement, it will be around deferment rates and capitalisation rate. Unlike the current position where it was determined very much by case law and then in terms of capitalisation rates by convention, we can now expect the Secretary of State, subject to the consultation exercise, to issue prescribed rates which will be applicable in all cases, and that of course is with the intention of keeping it simple. I'm afraid LAFRA has not kept it simple. In fact, it is, I was going through it last night for a talk for a client, and it is a monster of an act, and I think it will be keeping lawyers busy for many years to come.
Yeah, I agree. And I think we will have changes this year. It seems that there's some difficult stuff that is subject to consultation at the moment.
Absolutely.
So this is very much a
road.
work in progress.
Yeah.
The Labour government have committed to act quickly, in their own words. Do you have a feel for how soon we could see significant change? And in that interim period, what impact do you think this kind of limbo state that we've got at the moment will have on the market?
Well, I mean, I think they've got, as you mentioned at the beginning, I think, Chrissy, that the Labour government have identified that there are fundamental defects with LAFRA such that they will need to be remedied through primary legislation. Now, we know, given how long it took for LAFRA to come into effect, it can take years for that to happen. So it may not be a speedy exercise, added to which we simply don't know what those defects are. In terms of some of the procedural changes, for example, switching from 25% non-residential to 50%, I would expect to see those potentially coming into effect either at the back end of this year or in 2026. The effect of those changes should not be underestimated, and I, on a personal level, have grave misgivings about the pressure upon a consumer to be able to manage a complex mixed-use building by changing those thresholds. So watch this space, I think, on that one. In terms of other changes, I mean, case in point, an easy win by abolishing the 2-year ownership rule, that can be brought into effect. There may be other changes similar to that, which are pretty anodyne, but which nonetheless give the impression there is progress. I think the substantive changes will take longer. What do we do in the interim? I think the market has ground to a bit of a halt, and we'll talk about it a little later, but of course you've got renters' rights. You've also got the spectre of common hold, which is looming in the shadows at the moment and set to raise its head again if the government has its way. So at the moment it is a wait and see holding pattern, and I think generally considered to be quite unsatisfactory from everyone's perspective. Yeah,
I mean, you've mentioned common hold already. It is the elephant in the room when we're talking about leasehold reform generally. Setting aside complexities of the issues, and they are great in terms of the legislative framework that we would be required to implement the change, it seems inevitable that the leasehold and common hold reform bill will be published later this year, and it will have obviously wide-reaching and significant implications in the residential market. What do you think will be sort of the greatest challenge in navigating the proposed changes?
Well, I think from a sort of a commercial perspective, it will be getting lenders on board with it. And of course, as we know, don't we, all of us as real estate lawyers, creditworthiness and credit is the name of the game. If lenders don't trust the system, they will not go with it. Equally for developers, and obviously Richard and Vicky can talk about that from their experience later. But that is my primary concern. I think the only way you can really make this a form of home ownership which is compelling is by either making it compulsory and applying it uniformly across the board, which will be extremely difficult to implement given the prevalence of the leasehold structure, particularly in cities, or you create incentives so that it becomes the most attractive form of home ownership. Because bear in mind, if you're removing an income stream from a developer through ground rent, through whatever else it might be, they will want to see something in its place. My other concern around it, I think, Chrissy, is around the two-tier system that could be created if you suddenly have a far more attractive, from a leaseholder's perspective, form of ownership, namely common hold versus leasehold, which already has had extremely bad press, and you do not want any more downward pressure on value. So those are my key concerns.
Let's talk a little bit about the Renters' Rights Bill. It's currently storming Parliament, as we know, looking to receive a royal assent by Easter, I would have thought. What do you think we'll see in terms of the immediate impact in terms of the private renters sector market? And is there anything in particular you think we need to be worried about?
Well, on the second question, where do we begin? So there's plenty to be worried about, isn't there? I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? It will bite retrospectively. So in other words, all existing ASTs will become subject to the new regime. So I think there is going to be some problems with catching up. I don't think there's going to be a lead-in period, as far as I'm aware, for the market to catch up with this. So you need to hit the ground running, and there will be practical issues with making sure that happens. So we will have to see. Where you've got a good tenant, great. Of course, everybody wants the status quo to continue. Where there are issues, the pressure on the courts to get court orders is yet more pressure on an already highly stressed judicial system.
Yeah, and you've mentioned the judicial system. I mean, I suspect that we're going to see a lot of litigation coming down the track.
Absolutely. And the courts, as you know, are already struggling. So let's see where we get to on that.
Great. Thanks very much, Anna.
Thanks,
Richard, moving on to the developer sector, where to start really? Probably planning is the answer to that question. We can't talk about the developer sector without touching on planning reform. Obviously, Labour's planning and taxation reforms are set to transform land sales and the development landscape in 2025. That obviously creates both challenges and opportunities for house builders. Now, we need to be careful because we don't want to step on the toes of our planning colleagues. We've got an upcoming Places and Spaces webinar on the 14th of February where they will be exploring some of the key issues around planning reform and what that means for developer clients, what the key takeaways are from the white papers on planning reform and what might be missing from their proposals, etc. So I don't want to cover that ground. Of course, the main aim for reforms is to deliver economic growth and meet this very ambitious new housing target of 1.5 million new homes over the next 5 years. For now, though, as a very quick spoiler alert, what impact do you think the recent and upcoming planning reforms will have on brownfield development in the next few years?
Yeah, thank you, Chrissy. Strategic land acquisitions are increasing as investors are anticipating changes to the National Planning Policy Framework, especially in respect of greyfield sites. While recently, interest rates have decreased, which has made funding slightly more easy, and construction costs have stabilised, creating a bit more stability in the market, there is still a severe lack of supply in the housing market, leading to, pent-up demand and record prices. If the proposed planning proposals actually have the desired effect and create efficiencies in the market, leading to increased supply, then over time probably demand and supply will balance out, which will help to stabilise house prices and land prices. But in the short term, the volume of strategic acquisitions together with the lack of supply is affecting the price and business investment in that area. There's kind of four key policies I'd like to just mention in passing if I can. The first one is changes to the agricultural land market. So changes in inheritance tax affecting family farms is almost certainly going to lead to, unfortunately, a number of farming families having to sell their land, which will increase supply. But will that lead to demands to look at agricultural land uses? Who knows? Two, the sort of pro-development planning policies, such as mandatory housing targets, increasing greenfield and brownfield developments, the brownfield passports, all should hopefully increase activity within the housing market. But the problem is local authority planning departments are under-resourced, there's no money, so actually it's going to take time and delay in terms of getting those policies and planning through. You've also got issues around environmental impact assessments. I mean, interesting to note that Rachel Reeves talked about this at the weekend, see whether she follows through in sort of making that easier. We have to wait and see on that score. Then you have land value mitigation schemes. So there's talk of removing hope value, which might make it easier for local authorities to buy land for affordable housing. But that could also lead to landowners deciding, no, we're not going to sell, we'll wait for a better day and a changing regime. Lastly, there's the greyfield matters land. So that's likely to lead to more development and resi development within brownfield space, which is great. But The sort of downside to that is going to require 50% affordable housing. That's fine in areas with high land prices, but in areas where land prices don't justify that, that's going to need either a change in policy or financial support.
Yep. Briefly, what do you envisage as being the main challenges for our developer clients this year?
Well, it's interesting because there's definitely feel an improved sentiment in the market. If you go back a couple of years, everybody was saying stay alive to 25. Well, we're in 25, but actually we're alive, definitely. But a lot of the headwinds that developers faced are still there. So you've got a lack of supply, you've got competition for sites, you've got high land prices. On top of that, you've got a lot of private landlords putting their second-hand stock on the market, which competes with new build. You've got the building levy coming in later on, which is another sort of tax on house building in effect. You've got the existing issues around BNG, water neutrality, nutrient neutrality. Yes, while those issues are being resolved, it's still a hassle in causing delays. And then you've got the joys of removing stamp duty, land tax relief for first-time buyers, which will be a bit of a boom probably in the short term, but come the next financial year, probably be a slump. So you've got all these things that just make life a bit more tricky.
Add into the mix. Let's talk very briefly about contractual controls over land, because there was quite a lot of excitement last year on the aspects of the Levelling Up Act, which proposed the introduction of contractual controls over land in terms of being registered on a register. So things like option agreements, preemption agreements. There was the consultation earlier last year which tried to bottom out what that register would look like in practice, and it was thought that the register would go live in 2026. Have you got a feel, or what do you think will happen with this now that we've got our change in government?
Yeah, it's interesting because we first raised this and did a survey with clients a number of years ago, and there was a lot of fear and anxiety about it, thinking that it will probably give those objecting to development the upper hand. But actually, when the proposals came out last year, I think that actually it wasn't as bad as they thought. But yeah, since then, since the election, radio silence from the new government. So are they going to implement it? Are they not? Are they going to keep it as it was? Are they going to change things? So your guess is as good as mine, really. Let's watch this space.
And in terms of, just as we can't really talk about leasehold reform without Commonhold sitting there in the corner quietly, we can't really talk about the developer sector without talking about the Building Safety Act, which doesn't sit quietly in the corner. There remains really, it's not a flurry of activity around building safety, it's still a blizzard of activity, I think, evidenced, of course, not only by the government announcing its remediation acceleration plan, but we've also, as you just mentioned, we've got the Building Safety Levy, which comes into force later this year. We've also got a number of claims going through the courts now, and a lot of activity there, and obviously everyone's sort of hotly anticipating the Court of Appeal cases of Triathlon Homes and Hipsley Point in March. I think it's fair to say, though, that even with the case law developing and with various statutory amendments being made to bring much needed clarity to the legislation, there's going to remain an element of uncertainty in this area for so long as cladding needs remediation. So it's one for the long haul. This isn't going away anytime soon. Do you think the complexity and the uncertainty surrounding some of these provisions of the BSA is continuing to affect the developer sector, or do you think there's sort of a degree of adjustment and the industry is already beginning to feel more comfortable with these new regimes?
Yeah, sort of parking historic issues, because for developers, we're looking forward, not kind of backwards. I think there's certainly more clarity regarding, what the procedures they need to go through in order to start tall towers. I think though it's worth just stopping for a second, and the Building Safety Act has only been one of the issues affecting taller buildings. Really, if you think about it, the increase in interest rates, build cost rises, labour supply issues, all these things have had effect on the market. And if anything, maybe it's given the industry a bit of time to stand back and actually look at what they're proposing, actually whether they could be done better, whether there's better financial outcomes and schemes that actually more fit what people want going forward. So I think there are some positives in that. I mean, historically, the residential side of development has always been a bit like the cartoon character Roadrunner. They were literally laying the next bit at the very last minute. Whereas on the commercial side of things, there's been much more planning in terms of actually how the building's going to build out. Probably because you tend to have a separation between the investor and the money, the developer who's making the profit, and the contractor. Whereas in the residential market, those all three would tend to be the same person and gave them greater flexibility. So it's probably a good thing going forward, and actually ties in with the fact that you're now getting a lot of investment from funds into single family housing, all of which require more thought to be given to what's going to be delivered and how.
And let's talk a little bit about those longer lead-in times that we've got in the developer sector, and just to loop back round to what Anna and I were discussing in terms of common hold. How do you think the sort of idea of common hold and what's going to happen later this year is going to affect the developer sector?
It's just one of the other things that the house building industry needs to take on board. It's probably not top of the inbox, but it's going to work its way up there through the year. I think for now that there's 2 points that I think are worth mentioning. One is the interplay between common hold and mixed use. That needs a lot of thought about how that's going to work. And two, which Anna alluded to before, is possible two-tier market. A lot of large schemes can take 10 years to build out in phases. And, so I can see potential issues where you've got one phase where there's some units unsold and they're under leasehold type arrangement, and then the next phase is under common hold. And is there going to be an issue on pricing those two schemes? But for developers, they need everything gets done in advance, the actual paperwork. But are they going to want to go down common hold until they know the banks are going to fund? Yeah. It's not a simple, easy answer to this.
We'll let common hold lie for now then, and we'll move on, Vicky, to talk a little bit about the investor sector. There's a lot going on at an industry level. There seems to be a focus on real assets as opposed to real estate. In other words, the lines between real estate and infrastructure seem to be blurring. I think it's inevitable, really, that sustainability is going to remain a key feature of the market this year and for many years to come. Our very own government is discovering that net zero goals are extremely challenging to achieve. So perhaps EPCs and MEES is a good place to start. We've talked a fair bit about it in the residential sector and also about various acts and bills. MEES actually is one area there is a notable absence of legislation, particularly for the commercial sector. The government has confirmed its commitment to reforming energy performance of buildings. We've had the reforms to the energy performance of buildings regime consultation, which was launched very recently. But as yet, we don't have this guidance as to the trajectory of MEES going forward for commercial properties. Do you think 2025 will be the year where we get a little bit of clarity around that trajectory?
Well, interestingly, we've said before that the market doesn't like uncertainty, but actually, and there is uncertainty in terms of EPC, MEES, when is the change in the regime going to come in terms of what level the buildings need to be at. But actually, what we're finding is that certainly in the investment market, all that has already been factored in. So in fact, for many years, the investors that we're working with have already got a plan for upgrading buildings, retrofitting, whatever it might be, to meet those timelines of 2027 and 2030. So that's already been factored in. And I think what we're seeing in terms of the market is the EPC rating, the sustainability, all of those things are creating a two-tier market. So, for example, the office market, we're seeing the balance shift now. Workers are now on average in the office for 3.1 days per week, so the balance has shifted back to working in the office. That's obviously a change. And we're seeing that the best-in-class offices, the ones that have been retrofitted or have had the landlords actually thinking about the building and what they need to do, that is proving that's where the investment money is going to. Those buildings that have already made those adjustments have already factored in the change in MEES, potential change in MEES regulations, and we're actually finding that across the board. So There's definitely a two-tier market in terms of investment at the moment, and a lot of that is driven by sustainability. And we're also seeing that investors are telling us that the tenants in their buildings, their employees are interested in, that's the questions being asked in the interview. What's the EPC rating? What's your sustainability? All these kind of things. So the canny investors have already been doing that for a long time, and there will be a raft of other investors that will need to catch up with that.
So I think the point is, whether or not we hear about a future MEES trajectory this year, the market is actually ahead already, and you're seeing investor clients are already future-proofing their portfolios against whatever may come down the track. So actually the market's moving ahead of the regulatory framework in a way. Let's talk a little bit about the proposed reform of the 1954 Act and the implications for business tenancies. We've had the consultation and responses are due in February, only at the moment seeking views on the extent to which business tenancies should have protection. The obvious place to start really is from your experience in practice. Does it need tinkering with? Or are we looking at a situation where if it ain't broke, don't fix it?
I mean, it's interesting. Obviously, when we had the old system now, where you needed a court order, everybody hated that. If people can remember back that far, everybody hated that because that delayed transactions, and caused huge difficulties. But now we have a system that seems to work relatively well. There was huge changes from when there was last a change in terms of moving away from court orders. Obviously, we have the regime now. And effectively, the changes will flip that regime on its head, so the tenants have to opt in. I'm not seeing any, but no, I don't think this has reached many investors. They're not focusing on that at the moment. There's bigger ticket things in the market, such as will there be an interest rate cut this year? I think in terms of the market, they will view those changes as and when they happen, but I don't think they're not going to be terribly important from an investor point of view. I think at the moment, some of the sentiment is, look, we've got this system, it's not foolproof. To flip it around isn't actually, by the tenant having to opt in, it's just a different side of the coin. So I'm not sure, we'll obviously have to see what the consultation says, but at the moment, I think as you alluded to, if it's ain't broken, don't fix it.
I think really across the sectors we've got a little bit of reform, quite a lot of consult, and quite a lot of wait and see really. Thank you all so much for your really helpful insights across the sector. I think there's no doubt really that 2025 is going to be another very busy year. All this, and we haven't even touched on many areas, including high street rental auction rules, possible changes that could be brought in the telecom sector, and also we're obviously expecting the Law Society property sector guidance on climate risk and how to deal with that in the conveyancing process. As we move into 2025, the one certainty is that the UK real estate sector presents a landscape both of challenges and opportunities, and demands strategic legal guidance to navigate the complexities. I think you'd all agree that our job as professionals is twofold really. The first is to keep on top of this very fast moving legislative landscape, and the second is to facilitate complex commercial negotiations to actually get deals done. So much to be aware of and to keep on top of. We'll watch with interest and we'll keep you updated along the way. On which note, please don't forget about our Places and Spaces webinar on the 14th of February. And you can also sign up to our Property Perspectives newsletter, which comes out monthly on our website. Now, though, all that's left is to wish you all a very happy new year.